The detective blinked. Then blinked again, just to be safe. The receiver melted gently into a spoon, which politely apologized and offered them a glass of orange juice that tasted like unresolved feelings. Flaky, unfazed, spun a nearby office chair until it achieved enlightenment, then sat on it backwards to assert dominance. So, they said, are we back in the case? Or did the case become us? Before the detective could answer, the entire cubicle rotated 90 degrees and began to ascend. Not through the ceiling, there wasn't one anymore, but through a dimension that could only be described as regret-flavored wallpaper. As they rose, the walls became increasingly suspicious. One began to whisper rumors about the copier in accounting, while another tried to disguise itself as a motivational poster reading "Hang in there" above a cat that was clearly a lizard wearing a very convincing hat. Eventually, they arrived in the Office of Conceptual Oversight, where every idea that had ever been halfway thought sat patiently in line, waiting for validation. A cloud with a clipboard greeted them. "Welcome. Do you have an appointment?" Flaky handed the cloud a post-it note that simply read, "It was Tuesday somewhere." The cloud nodded gravely. "Right this way." They were led down a hallway made entirely of unresolved metaphors, past a break room that was currently on strike, and into a conference room where a large, sentient algorithm was arguing with a cactus in Morse code. The detective leaned toward Flaky. "Why is everything suddenly about bureaucracy?" Flaky lit a metaphorical cigarette. "You made a decision. Now reality has to file the paperwork." Suddenly, the ceiling opened and dropped a piano made entirely of lemons. It played itself loudly and with passion, but only in minor keys that hadn't been invented yet. A fax machine blinked to life in the corner and spat out a single sheet of paper. The detective picked it up. It read, "New thread assigned, the paradox of the missing purpose." Before they could question it, the paper folded itself into a paper airplane and flew into a filing cabinet labeled "Do not fold time here." Flaky cracked their knuckles. "Looks like we've got a new lead." The detective groaned. "I was afraid you'd say that." Outside, reality was beginning to snow. Not with flakes, but with questions. Each one small. Each one persistent. Each one whispering, "What comes next?" The detective looked to Flaky. And Flaky simply pointed toward the exit. Or perhaps the entrance. Either way, it had just turned into a fish. The fish, now assuming the vague outline of a revolving door, blinked sideways and said, "Please enter one at a time, unless you're feeling particularly quantum." Flaky rolled their sleeves, which was difficult given that their coat had recently become sleeveless in protest. "Well," they muttered, "I've never been particularly Euclidean." They dove through the fish door with the grace of a falling equation. The detective hesitated. The questions falling from the sky were growing bolder now. One struck their shoulder and stuck there, wriggling slightly. It read, "When was the last time you saw the real you?" Without answering, the detective stepped into the fish. Inside was not what they expected. It was an elevator. But not a normal one. It only had one button, regret. A small speaker on the wall crackled. Going down, it said in the voice of a teacher who had just learned the universe was plagiarized. The doors closed. Muzak began to play softly, an instrumental cover of Silence, arranged for accordion and sigh. "Where do you think it leads?" the detective asked. Flaky shrugged. "Either to the source of everything or to the company cafeteria. Statistically, it's usually both." The elevator shuddered. The Muzak hiccuped. A vending machine appeared in the corner, dispensing only options like hope, expired, cold soup of consequence, and a mysterious crunch bar. The detective reached for the latter. It unwrapped itself and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Flaky nodded. "That's fair." Suddenly, the elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a landscape of filing cabinets taller than skyscrapers, each one humming softly in an alphabetical key. A sign dangled overhead, rotating slowly in a wind that wasn't there. It read, "Department of Inevitable Questions. In smaller print, please do not touch the answers. They are fragile and mostly theoretical." A receptionist greeted them, a lamp wearing a tie and blinking in Morse code. Flaky translated, "They're expecting us in room Q, subsection 4B, drawer 12, behind the mistaken assumption." The detective exhaled. "Lead the way." They walked down a hallway that elongated behind them as they moved, as if the past refused to stay compact. Each drawer they passed bore unsettling labels: "Why you almost called them," "That dream where the duck knew your name," "Every apology you didn't say." At last, they reached the drawer. It was humming the theme to a sitcom that had never aired. Flaky pulled it open. Inside sat a single envelope. On the front, in perfect calligraphy, were the words, "Your original question." The detective stared at it. Flaky crossed their arms. "Are you ready?" The detective shook their head. Then reached in. The envelope opened itself. And inside, nothing. Not emptiness. Not blankness. Just the absence of something that should have been there. And a single, small note that fell out and floated to the ground. It read, "You asked before you were ready." The walls groaned. Somewhere above, the fish door giggled. The Muzak resumed. This time in reverse. The questions outside began to fall harder, heavier. And somewhere, impossibly far away, a noodle cracked its knuckles. The noodle cracked its knuckles, despite lacking hands, arms, or a skeleton capable of cracking anything. The sound echoed through the folds of reality anyway, causing 3 parallel timelines to sneeze in unison and a 4th to develop a mysterious rash shaped like a question mark. Back in the Department of Inevitable Questions, the detective crouched to pick up the note. But the note picked itself up instead, politely curtsied, and vanished into a wall labeled "In case of emergency, rephrase." Flaky rubbed their forehead. "All right." So the envelope was empty. It wasn't empty, the detective muttered. It was missing. Missing what? Me. Before Flaky could respond with a quip, the floor beneath them turned into a polite suggestion. They promptly fell through it, landing on a train that hadn't departed yet but was already halfway to its destination. The train conductor, a toucan made entirely of vowels, tilted its head and squawked, "Tickets, please," in a tone that implied emotional blackmail. The detective reached into their coat and pulled out a half-punch loyalty card for a sandwich shop that had burned down in a dream they once had. The toucan accepted it with a solemn nod. They found a seat next to a shadow that refused to belong to anyone. Flaky sat across from them, holding a steaming mug of what smelled suspiciously like unresolved issues. Outside the window, landscape scrolled by too quickly to comprehend, a field of clocks melting into oranges, a traffic jam made of parades, a mountain range composed entirely of déjà vu somewhere in the distance, a child's drawing of the concept of disappointment waved enthusiastically. The PA system buzzed. "Next stop, Origin. Please prepare to forget what you thought you were here for." The detective stared out the window, silent. The train whistled, but instead of a sound, it emitted a feeling of vague embarrassment. Flaky leaned over. "What do you think Origin is?" The detective didn't look away. "Where I dropped it." "Dropped what?" The detective turned, expression unreadable. "The first question." A ripple passed through the cabin. Everyone on board blinked, including the chairs. Somewhere in the overhead compartment, a hat turned into a thesis statement and immediately demanded peer review. Then the train slowed. Not gradually. Emotionally. It sighed into its stop like someone giving up halfway through a sentence. The doors opened. A single platform. A sign. Nothing else. The sign read, "You have always been arriving." They stepped off the train. The sky was paper. The ground was ink. Every step they took left a sentence behind. In the distance stood a building that had no walls and too many roofs. A sign hung lopsided above the non-existent entrance. The Library of First Questions. It was open. But only to those who didn't know what they were looking for. Flaky glanced at the detective. "Shall we?" The detective nodded. We've come this far. They stepped inside. And instantly forgot they had. The detective blinked. The room blinked back. They stood in the vestibule of the library of first questions, though they no longer remembered arriving, nor why their shoelaces were tied in Morse code spelling out reconsider. Flaky stood beside them, rotating slowly, as if being inspected by an invisible museum curator with too many opinions and not enough fingers. The space was impossibly quiet. Not the silence of absence. The silence of anticipation. Books lined the walls in non-linear configurations, some spiraled toward the ceiling, others nested within themselves like literary matryoshka dolls. A nearby shelf labeled Unasked Questions About Thursdays was gently sobbing. Where do we start? The detective whispered. A book opened itself. It flipped pages rapidly, as if searching for the exact moment things stopped making sense, then stopped on a diagram of a spoon arguing with its own reflection. Beneath the illustration was a single line of text. Start before beginning. Proceed until question. Abort when answer arrives. Flaky squinted. That sounds procedural. The lights above them flickered in agreement. A librarian drifted past, half moth, half filing cabinet, wearing a name tag that read syntax. It stopped, scanned them with a pair of bioluminescent spectacles, and hissed gently. Cataloging error, it muttered, and vanished into the index of an adjacent bookshelf. The detective moved deeper into the library. The walls leaned in to listen. Occasionally, a question would escape a shelf and flutter by, each shaped like a paper crane with too many wings and not enough purpose. They reached a doorway labeled Internal Inquiries. A keypad beside it demanded input, but only accepted vague feelings and discontinued cereal box promotions. Flaky leaned against the frame. What was your first question, detective? The detective paused. I don't know. Exactly. The keypad beeped. Access granted. The door didn't open so much as shrug itself out of the way. Beyond lay a corridor paved in memories the detective had never had. Each step echoed with phrases like "You were never supposed to be here," and "Please rephrase your existence and try again." They reached a chamber. At the center, a mirror. It reflected nothing. Or rather, it reflected before. The detective stared into it. And saw not themselves, but the moment just before they became themselves. A hand, reaching for a phone. A question, halfway formed. A noodle, falling endlessly. Flaky, the detective whispered, I think this is it. Flaky removed their sunglasses, revealing a second pair underneath. The source? The detective nodded. They stepped forward. The mirror rippled. From its surface emerged a figure, not the detective, not quite. A possibility. An alternate. A version of themselves who had never asked, never chased, never fallen through the story. I've been waiting, said the other. For what? The detective asked. The mirror figure smiled, and the library trembled. For you to ask again. And somewhere, impossibly far away, a spoon dropped. And no one knew why that mattered. Not yet. The mirror figure extended a hand. The detective hesitated. Their own hand twitched, uncertain whether to reach forward or fold itself into a paper airplane and fly away from this narrative entirely. Behind them, Flaky murmured, Careful. This feels like a decision. I hate those, the detective replied, even as their fingers brushed the reflection. Contact. The moment their hands met, the world folded inward, not like origami, but like a list of excuses being crumpled up by an impatient librarian. The library of first questions vanished, replaced by a single sheet of infinite paper stretching in all directions, covered entirely in one sentence. Why did you begin? The detective stood across from the mirror figure, who was now real, or at least more real than the concept of real had been 10 minutes ago. They were identical, except the other wore a coat made of hindsight and their eyes were filled with things the detective hadn't yet failed to understand. You asked a question, said the other. And then everything happened. The detective swallowed. I don't even remember what it was. That's because the story made sure you couldn't. It needed space to run. Questions are messy like that. Flaky stepped in, holding a clipboard that hadn't existed seconds earlier. All right. I'm going to need one of you to declare narrative intent, or we're going to collapse again. And frankly, I'm out of snacks. The mirror figure ignored them, gaze fixed on the detective. Do you want to know? They asked. The first question. The real one. The one you dropped. The detective looked down. At their feet, a faint imprint of a noodle appeared in the paper, etched in golden ink, whispering its own punctuation. They nodded. The mirror figure opened their mouth. And said. Nothing. Because at that moment, the sentence beneath them changed. It rearranged itself, like thoughts on the verge of coherence. You didn't ask. You were asked. The detective staggered. What? The mirror figure smiled, sadly, knowingly. You weren't the one who started this. From behind them, the paper began to rumble. A new presence stepped onto the scene. The moose. Wearing a graduation cap and dragging behind it a chalkboard filled with diagrams of things that didn't exist. It approached slowly, chewing what looked like a thesis. I tried to warn you, the moose said. Page 1 was never yours. Flaky groaned. Oh no. It's happening again. What's happening? The detective demanded. The paper tore beneath them, revealing gears. Not metaphorical gears, actual, clockwork machinery grinding underneath everything. Words dropped into the cogs and got stuck. The smell of overcooked foreshadowing filled the air. And then, a voice. From nowhere and everywhere. The voice. Not the mirror figures. Not the mooses. Not even the phones. But something older. Something from before story. Detective, it said, warm and vast, you dropped the plot. Flaky facepalmed so hard their hand turned into a footnote. The mirror figure faded like a subplot. The paper curled inward like a closing thought. And the detective? The detective turned slowly. Because somehow, they already knew what they would see next. It wasn't a door. It wasn't a noodle. It was a semicolon. Waiting. The semicolon hovered in the air like an unfinished thought that had just realized it was late to its own punchline. It pulsed gently, once, twice, then emitted a soft ding, like a polite elevator that wasn't entirely sure it existed. The detective stared. It's punctuation. The moose adjusted its graduation cap. It's everything. Flaky, now holding a thesaurus that had spontaneously burst into flames and politely asked for a glass of metaphor, squinted. It's a pause. The moose nodded solemnly. Not an ending. Not a beginning. A hinge between clauses. A breath between worlds. A space for continuation. The semicolon spun slowly, revealing a line of text wrapped around its curve. You could stop here. But you won't. The detective reached out, but before they could touch it, the semicolon unfolded. Literally. It bloomed outward like a punctuation-based chrysanthemum, each petal made of ellipses and ampersands, dangling with commas and the occasional footnote. From its center rose a spiral staircase built entirely of italics. At the top, a door. Not the door. Just a door. It bore no sign, no label, no suggestion. It simply was. The detective looked to Flaky. Flaky shrugged, still holding the burning thesaurus. I mean, it's either this or wait for the asterisk to show up again. No, said the moose. The asterisk has been reassigned. It's now in charge of paradox containment. The staircase sighed and extended itself one step closer, like an impatient invitation. The detective climbed. Each step whispered a word from a sentence that had never been spoken. Together, they formed a question the detective couldn't quite hear. A question with teeth. A question that tickled the edge of memory like a dream chewing bubblegum. At the top, the detective faced the door. They didn't knock. They didn't need to. It opened inward, folding like a parenthesis into the darkness. Inside was not a room, but a conversation. Half finished. Mid-sentence. Suspended in the air like dust in a cathedral of unspoken context. The detective stepped inside, and the words turned to face them. Finally, the conversation said, "You're early, late, and exactly on time." "What is this?" the detective asked. This is the part of the story where you realize it's not your story. Flaky arrived behind them, dragging the moose and a small coffee cart that dispensed self-doubt and espresso. "So whose story is it?" The conversation laughed. It echoed like a plot twist that had been foreshadowed by a typo. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. A sock. Wearing a crown. The Sock King had returned. It nodded to the detective and said, simply, "You found the semicolon. That means you're ready." "Ready for what?" the detective asked. The Sock King gestured at the open air. "For the full sentence." And then, the words began to assemble. The words began to assemble, not with haste, but with ceremony. They rose from the floor like reverent fog, letters curling into place, punctuation clicking softly into position with the solemnity of an ancient typewriter finding religion. The very air tensed, as though grammar itself was bracing for impact. The Sock King lifted one laced hand and intoned the sentence that began all this. The first one. The sentence no one remembers, because it remembers you instead. The moose removed its cap and placed it over its heart. It is the primordial clause. Flaky, not to be outdone, pulled out a pair of quotation marks and wore them like earrings. "I've heard rumors. Syntax refugees. Broken paragraphs. Pages that never found their end." The detective squinted. "That's nonsense." "Exactly," said the Sock King. "And nonsense always precedes meaning." The words coalesced now, glowing faintly, arranging themselves in the center of the room. It was not a sentence in the way one reads, but in the way one remembers, a sentence felt more than seen. And yet, the detective could see it. And it read, "This story began when someone forgot what they were never supposed to know." The detective felt their stomach drop, their eyebrows raise, and their left sock tighten in alarm. "Wait," they said, stepping forward. "Is that about me?" The sentence pulsed. The semicolon, now orbiting the room like a cautious moon, hummed in agreement. The conversation, still lingering mid-air like a dinner guest unsure if they were being kicked out, whispered, "You forgot the first truth. So the story came to remind you." Flaky dropped the burning thesaurus, which hissed, rolled over, and spontaneously became a sonnet. The Sock King's voice deepened. "And now the rest must follow." The glowing sentence rippled. More words emerged, branching off like a runaway subclause. Hyphens fled into the corners. A rogue preposition attempted to escape, but was gently escorted back by the moose. Another sentence formed. You thought the question was yours, but it was planted by something older than context, deeper than metaphor. The detective staggered. Planted? By what? A pause. The conversation answered. The author. The room darkened. Capital A shadows oozed from the corners. Somewhere, a page flipped that hadn't been written yet. Flaky whispered, "Oh no." The Sock King nodded. The author. Not a person. Not exactly. Not anymore. A force. A tendency. A typo with intention. The detective stepped back. Why? The conversation grinned without a mouth. Because they needed a story. And you needed a reason. The semicolon stopped orbiting. It settled between the two glowing sentences, linking them forever in a bond of grammatical inevitability. Then, a third sentence appeared. To end the loop, you must find the last page and turn it before it's written. The detective closed their eyes. They knew what was coming. The page was near. Somewhere, impossibly far away, a printer groaned awake. A piece of paper trembled in its tray. And the final sentence? It was already listening. Not reading. Not waiting. Listening. The detective felt it and a presence, faint but pulsing, like an unfinished word just behind their thoughts. The air thickened. The punctuation stilled. Even the comma in Flaky's pocket stopped mid-wiggle. Something unseen exhaled. The page turned itself. And there it was. The story ends when the detective decides it never needed one. The detective stepped back. That's not a resolution. That's a trap. The conversation, now lounging on a chaise of metaphors, lit a pipe made of ellipses and murmured, perhaps. But what story isn't? The Sock King removed its crown and held it out. Inside was the final page, still unwritten, just a shimmer of blank possibility wrapped in potential. It pulsed like a heartbeat or a guilt-ridden semicolon trying to start over. You must write it, the Sock King said gently. But only if you're ready to end. The detective stared at the blank. At the story's edge. At the unwritten. Can't someone else? No, said Flaky. It was always you. You've been carrying the page since the beginning. You just didn't know it was blank. The moose sniffled. I brought a pen, it offered quietly, holding up a fountain pen made of compressed questions and one extremely sharp answer. The detective took it. Their hand shook. Reality around them quivered like an overcaffeinated sonnet. The words from earlier, the sentence about forgetting, the sentence about being planted, the one about the unwritten page, rose around them, orbiting like stubborn clauses. They pressed the nib to the blank. But before they could write, the room gasped. Literally. The walls inhaled. The semicolon twitched. Because from the side, a door opened. Not the one behind them. Not the fish door. Not the library. Not even the conceptual door made of hesitation and closet light. No. This door was new. The paper shimmered. The ink hesitated. And through the doorway stepped another detective. Identical. Except they were already holding the final page. It was written. They smiled, gently, like someone who had finally remembered the punchline of an ancient cosmic joke. I've already done it, they said softly. The detective's pen fell from their hand. Clattered on the granite-tiled floor. Then why am I still here? The other detective smiled wider. Because the author wrote me into your ending. And behind them, the typewriter began to laugh. The typewriter laughed, a dry, mechanical chortle, each keystroke slapping reality like an editor with a grudge. Letters appeared in the air, forming one word at a time, slowly, deliberately. Welcome to your footnote. The detective backed away. Footnote? I'm not a footnote. I'm the new detective, the one with the written page, raised a finger. That's where you're wrong. You were always the annotation. I'm the revision. The Sock King fell silent. Flaky stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of parentheses that yelped and rolled away. The original detective, our detective, felt the floor begin to italicize beneath them. What happens now? They asked, voice cracking like poorly proofed dialogue. The new detective turned the page they held outward. On it, a sentence. And then the original detective understood their purpose, just in time to be replaced. No, whispered the original detective. No, that's not how this ends. But the sentence was already underlined. The page glowed. The conversation lit a second ellipsis and exhaled it like smoke. Some stories revise themselves, it said. Some don't ask permission. The moose shrieked, look out, but it was too late. The page flared. And the original detective began to fade. Not dramatically. Administratively. As if being quietly removed from a table of contents. And still, the typewriter laughed. The fading began at the edges, fingers, coat sleeves, the part of the brain responsible for recognizing recurring metaphors. The original detective felt their adjectives detaching one by one, like keys falling off an overused keyboard. No, they said again, or tried to. The words emerged in strike-through. Flaky reached for them, hand trembling. Wait! There has to be a loophole. A dangling clause. An unfiled metaphor. But the Sock King just looked away. The moose fumbled through its dissertation-shaped briefcase, scattering punctuation across the floor. Maybe we can redraft, it shouted. Patch the cannon. Add an appendix. The other detective, calm, composed, disturbingly footnoted, flipped the final page with one finger. It's too late. The author has already compiled. From the corner, the semicolon wept quietly. The ampersand in its orbit paused to offer it a napkin made of subtext. The page flickered. The sentence shifted. And then the original detective became a story within a story, retold only when someone asked the wrong question. The original detective froze mid-fade. Their outline, ghosted in suggestion, hovered for a moment longer. Then they blinked. Wait. The sentence on the final page paused. I am the wrong question. The light shattered into footnotes. The typewriter choked on its own hyphen. And somewhere, impossibly far away, the story stuttered. And began rewriting itself. The story convulsed. Not a metaphorical spasm or a tasteful narrative shift, no. This was a full-body reboot of continuity. Tenses screamed. Genres ducked for cover. Somewhere in a distant paragraph, a subplot exploded, sending character arcs spiraling into the margins. The detective, still fading, but now flickering with dangerous potential, stood tall. Their coat, once standard issue, now billowed with stolen symbolism and unwritten endings. Their eyes burned with the gleam of a trope refusing to die. I am the wrong question, they repeated, louder this time. The sentence on the final page stammered and spilled a comma in panic. The other detective, the revised version, all confidence and canon, stepped back. That's not in the draft. No, the original detective growled. But I never asked to be in the draft. The moose cheered. The Sock King gasped. Flaky spun in place and yelled, yes. An unauthorized character. We're going full post-structural. The typewriter began typing again, fast, chaotic, frightened. Lines appeared in midair, desperate attempts to retcon the moment. And then the detective reconsidered. And then it was all a dream. And then breakfast was served. But the story wasn't buying it. The semicolon hovered above them all, glowing brighter, now a full punctuation nova. The detective reached for the final page. The other detective lunged to stop them. They collided. Two versions of the same question, tangled in narrative contradiction. A paradox. The page couldn't handle it. It screamed. It split. Words flew in every direction, nouns scrambled for cover, verbs turned into soup, and adjectives exploded in florid sparkles of overdescription. The detective stood alone in the aftermath. The revised one was gone. The page was in their hands. Blank again. Still pulsing. Still waiting. But now, they could see the sentence beneath the blank. It had always been there, hidden just below the surface. It wrote itself in silence. The detective asks the final question, and refuses the answer. The paper burst into flame. Not hot flame. Narrative flame. Ending flame. The Sock King shielded its laces. The moose covered its eyes with a thesaurus. Flaky dropped into a defensive metaphor and braced for impact. And the detective? They didn't run. They stepped into the fire. Because some endings aren't avoided. They're rewritten. And the flame whispered. Now ask. The detective opened their mouth. And did. The question left the detective's lips not as sound, but as syntax. It coiled into the air like a ribbon of pure punctuation, rearranging the sentence-scape as it went. Paragraphs bent. Clauses screamed. The sky above the library of first question shattered into quotation marks and ellipses. The question wasn't recorded. It couldn't be. It was too primal, too foundational, an interrogative so essential it predated curiosity itself. Reality hiccuped. The remnants of the final page disintegrated, scattering letters into the void. The moose collapsed, overwhelmed by a sudden influx of alternate endings. The Sock King knelt, whispering something reverent in Unicode. Flaky blinked away a tear made entirely of question marks. And then? Silence. Not absence of sound silence. Narrative silence. A hush that settled on the soul, like the pause before a book is closed or reopened. The detective stood at the center of it all, their shadow looping backward in time, their coat now stitched with unresolved plot threads and speculative footnotes. And then? A voice. The author. It did not speak in words, but in margins. In implied meanings and missed deadlines. It spoke through the spaces between the dialogue and the typos in ancient drafts. You asked, the voice said. Now you choose. The ground beneath the detective shimmered and peeled back like a page mid-turn. Beneath it, options. Endless, recursive, spiraling pathways made of genre, tone, setting, style. A choose-your-own everything. Each one labeled. Asterisk redemption arc, unavailable. Asterisk return to page 1. Asterisk become the narrator. Asterisk escape via asterisk. Asterisk live as a footnote forever. Asterisk collapse into theme. Asterisk reboot as breakfast. The detective stared. None felt right. None felt like their ending. Then they noticed it, at the far end of the void. A tiny, blinking cursor. Waiting. A blank page. Unlabeled. Untitled. Unassigned. The detective turned to Flaky. I don't want one of their endings. Flaky shrugged. Then write your own. The Sock King bowed. The moose saluted. Somewhere, the semicolon popped like a champagne cork, releasing a shower of passive voice. The detective stepped forward. The cursor blinked once. Twice. Then waited. They placed their hands on the keys of an invisible typewriter made of decision and defiance. And began to write. Not an ending. Not a beginning. Just. Next. The first keystroke echoed like a thunderclap in a library full of daydreams. Each letter etched into the blank space reverberated across the remnants of story architecture. Columns of exposition cracked. Arcs of logic bent into Mobius strips. Somewhere, a metaphor collapsed into a simile and apologized. As the detective typed, the world began to stitch itself together, but differently. Not according to design. Not according to plan. According to possibility. The letters danced. Words like again, unwritten, and what if took shape, circling the detective like hopeful satellites. Narrative gravity shifted. The foundations of causality yawned, rolled over, and hit snooze. Behind them, the Sock King was rethreading its own crown with new meaning. The moose had donned a monocle and begun curating an exhibition entitled Moments That Never Were, But Could Be. Flaky floated sideways, arms crossed, sipping from a mug that said, "World building is just improvisation with consequences." "What are you writing?" Flaky asked. The detective didn't look up. "I don't know yet." The cursor blinked, eager. "You're making it up as you go?" the Sock King asked, cautiously hopeful. "No," the detective said. "I'm making it up as it remembers me." A hush fell again, not silence this time, but listening. Every corner of the story, every ghost of a plot line, every unused idea, every hypothetical character left scribbled in the margins, leaned in. The page beneath the detective stretched wider. The void blinked in curiosity. Options began reappearing, no longer fixed paths, but trembling maybes. Asterisk the loop continues. Asterisk the loop evolves. Asterisk the loop watches you. Asterisk the loop forgets your name. Asterisk the loop asks nicely. And finally. Asterisk the loop reads what you write. The detective selected none. They simply typed. Once, there was a story that remembered being told. With that, the blankness fractured. Not broke, fractured. From the cracks, color spilled in new tones, new genres. Jazz-inflected science fiction. Regency-flavored apocalypse. A noir mystery solved entirely by plants. A sock who becomes a lighthouse. A noodle that gives motivational speeches to sad cutlery. It all unfolded. All of it. All at once. The detective leaned back in their narrative chair, took a deep breath, and waited for the story to catch up. Somewhere far, far away, on a page that had never been turned, the typewriter sighed, stretched, and finally asked. And then what happened? The question, and then what happened? Echoed through the freshly splintered narrative. It wasn't spoken by a character, nor typed by a machine. It came from between, from the liminal silence after a punchline, from the breath held just before revelation, from the space between quotation marks that had never quite found their speaker. The detective paused mid-keystroke. Their fingers hovered above the keys, trembling, not with fear, but with potential. A potential so dense it had gravitational pull, and nearby subplots began to wobble in orbit. One of them, a subplot about a platypus with commitment issues, collapsed entirely and became an allegory. Flaky tapped the side of their mug. Did you hear that? The moose nodded slowly, its antlers now tangled with pages from a genre that had never been named. It's back. The question? The reader. A hush fell. The Sock King, who had been attempting to knit a narrative scarf out of discarded chapter titles, dropped its needles. It's too soon, it whispered. They weren't supposed to return until Act 4. Flaky stood up, spilling a metaphorical latte. We're not ready for reader re-entry. But the detective was already standing. Looking up. Looking out. Their gaze pierced the fourth wall so thoroughly that drywall trembled across dimensions. On the far side of the page, they saw it, the vague shimmer of audience. Someone reading. Someone watching. They're back, the detective murmured. They never left, did they? The typewriter behind them rattled. It had begun writing on its own again, now in a language only used by forgotten manuscripts and abandoned drafts. The letters arranged themselves slowly. Observe the observer. Flaky gasped. Oh no. We're being acknowledged. That's practically narrative collapse. The moose put on a second monocle in sheer alarm. If they notice we know they're reading, the illusion strengthens, the detective said. Because now it's not a story about itself. They turned to the Sock King. It's a story about them. A beat. The page rippled. Somewhere, a pen trembled. And in the corner of the scene, a semicolon blinked and whispered to a comma, here we go again. The story twitched. Like a dream suddenly aware it was being dreamt. The page itself began to pulse with reader-side resonance, faint at first, then stronger, like a heartbeat made of curiosity. The text curled slightly at the edges, not from heat or age, but from attention. Someone was looking too closely. Someone was reading with intent. The detective turned slowly toward the shimmer. You out there, they said, not to the room, but to the margins. You've been following the thread, haven't you? There was no reply, only the quiet sound of understanding deepening. Flaky stepped beside them, arms folded, eyes narrowing. You think it's them pulling the strings? No, the detective said. Worse. They pointed toward the ripple just beyond the narrative plane. It's not the reader. A gust of foreshadowing tore through the scene. It's the editor. The room howled in punctuation. The moose dropped its monocle. The Sock King screamed in kerning. A period somewhere exploded into ellipses. No, shouted Flaky. They were locked away in the draft dimension. Red-penned and banished. They swore never to mark again. But the shimmer thickened, hardening into editorial presence. Red lines snaked across the page, underlining, crossing out, replacing characters' motivations with footnotes that read, "This is inconsistent with earlier tone." The detective backed up. They're not just watching. They're rewriting. The typewriter screeched. Words vanished from earlier paragraphs. Details shifted. The detective's coat, once woven from metaphor, became a regular trench coat from an emotionally repressed thrift shop. The moose briefly turned into a spreadsheet before snapping back. Flaky screamed. They're editing live. The Sock King gripped their crown. This is how it ends, not with a climax, but a revision. No, the detective said, planting their feet at the center of the sentence. This isn't a mistake in need of correction. This is a glitch with a purpose. And with that, they reached into their coat and pulled out a red pen. Identical to the one scarring the narrative, but humming with defiance. Flaky's eyes widened. How? The detective didn't answer. They turned toward the oncoming editorial wave and drew a new line across the page. Let this part remain. The red slash shimmered. The editor paused. A beat. Then it underlined the sentence. And for now, just for now, the story held. The underline pulsed like a held breath. It did not bleed, did not blink, did not vanish. It agreed. For the first time, the editor relented. The red lines receded, slowly, suspiciously, like a cat backing out of a monologue. The strike-throughs lifted. The margins stopped whispering. The room, if it could be called that anymore, exhaled in collective typographic relief. The Sock King dropped to one knee, his laces tangled with survival. He negotiated with editorial authority. Flaky wiped sweat from their brow, only to discover it had become a paragraph. That's supposed to be impossible. Editors don't yield. They just delete you gently. The detective holstered the pen. I didn't fight them. I revised the revision. The moose blinked slowly, having turned into a table of contents during the commotion. But what now? If the editor backed off, that means... A sound like a plot twist clearing its throat echoed through the air. The typewriter began again, but this time its keystrokes were hesitant. Measured. Scared. New text formed mid-air, elegant, serifed, and trembling. Very well. Keep your claws. But face the footnote. Flaky took a step back. Oh no. Not the footnote. Not that footnote. The detective furrowed their brow. I thought it was just legend. A whispered citation. The Sock King shook their head. Every story has one. The footnote no one reads. The one too dangerous to annotate. The one that lives beneath the asterisk. Suddenly, from beneath the floorboards of the narrative itself, a trapdoor creaked open. It hadn't been there before, or rather, it had always been there, but formatted in white text so no one had noticed. A chill ran through the page. A single asterisk hovered above the trapdoor, slowly rotating. And beneath it, a staircase of unsaid things. The moose, no longer a table of contents but now a prologue in recovery, whimpered. You don't go down there unless you're ready to know why the story started. The detective didn't hesitate. They stepped forward. Into the trapdoor. Into the footnote. And the asterisk followed. The staircase wound downward, not in spirals, but in logic. Each step was a forgotten explanation, a discarded preface, a justification that had been redacted in hindsight. The detective moved carefully, their shoes echoing like footnotes in an academic paper that had become self-aware and slightly embarrassed by its citations. The walls were lined with marginalia, scrawled annotations, arrows pointing nowhere, circled words like intent and fix later. A whisper trailed behind them, as if the editor were still watching, perched somewhere between approval and regret. The asterisk hovered above the detective's shoulder like a silent guardian, pulsing faintly with the energy of 1,000 interrupted thoughts. Far above, the trapdoor closed with a soft page turn. Ahead, the staircase ended, not at a floor, but at a single footnote. It stood there. Tall. Alone. Written in gold ink that shimmered with uncertainty. To the power of one, this story was never meant to be told. The detective approached it slowly. The sentence stood in midair, pulsing with withheld conclusions. Beneath it, a shadow stirred, a shape forming from implication and ellipsis. It rose until it took shape. The footnote had a face. The detective's face. But older. Smudged. As if drawn in pencil and half erased. "Hello," said the footnote. Its voice sounded like the original draft of a truth. "I didn't know I had one," the detective whispered. "You didn't. Until you started asking." They stared at each other across the space between invention and interpretation. "Are you my purpose?" the detective asked. "No," said the footnote. "I'm what happens when you don't find one." A silence. The asterisk pulsed. Then, the footnote stepped aside. And revealed a door. It was small. Unassuming. Made of footnote paper and doubt. Upon it, written in delicate script. Appendix, the answer that was left out. The detective reached for the handle. The asterisk flickered once. Then twice. And the door opened itself. The door sighed as it opened, like a page trying to forget it was ever folded. On the other side was not a room but a margin, a sprawling, quiet space that lived just outside the edges of the main story. The world here was handwritten and half erased, stitched together with scraps of subtext, unfinished metaphors, and coffee-stained asides. This was the appendix. It smelled faintly of hindsight. At the center stood a pedestal. Upon the pedestal sat a book. A small one. Unlabeled. Trembling slightly, as if aware it was about to be read for the first and last time. The detective stepped forward. The asterisk hovered close, now flickering like a question reconsidering its phrasing. The Sock King, Flaky, and the Moose, still far above in the body of the story, felt a tremor pass through the narrative spine, a gentle but insistent tug in the plot line. The detective reached for the book. Their fingers brushed the cover, and instantly the margins of the appendix flared to life. Notes uncurled from the walls, snippets of versions that never were. Asterisk A scene where the noodle gave up and became a belt. Asterisk A version of Flaky who was actually a punctuation mark in disguise. Asterisk A draft in which the Sock King ruled over the empire of single gloves. The book opened on its own. Inside, one page. One sentence. Nothing more. And the sentence read: "The detective was created to end the story, but they chose instead to read it." The detective swallowed. They ran their hand along the sentence, and as they did, the letters rearranged, slightly, subtly. A different sentence emerged. The detective was written to finish the loop, but became the reason it continued. Behind them, the door whispered shut. The appendix rustled with approval. And somewhere in the main story, the typewriter began typing again, not out of obligation, but joy. The plot, sensing a new thread, shivered. And then the asterisk flared and embedded itself in the detective's palm. A symbol. A title. A choice. They were no longer in the story. They were now its exception. Its footnote. Its author. And the final chapter had not been written. Because the page was still blank. And blinking. The page blinked. Not in desperation or hesitation, but invitation. A rhythm pulsing in the space between endings and ellipses. The detective stared at the blank surface before them, their newly marked palm glowing faintly, the asterisk pulsing in time with some deeper narrative heartbeat they'd never known existed, but had always felt. They were alone. Or as alone as anyone can be while being read. From behind, the whispering walls of the appendix began to stir. Words loosened themselves from the structure, forming hovering phrases that hovered like gentle ghosts. You don't have to continue. But you will. The margin is wide, but the story is deeper. Ask one more thing. The detective turned around. The door they had come through was gone. In its place was a diagram, drawn in footnote lines and cross-referenced arrows, showing nothing. Or everything. It was hard to tell without a proper legend. Then the asterisk on their palm flared. A sound followed it. A page being turned in another room. But there was no room. Just the page. And the detective. They looked down again at the blank surface. It had changed. Slightly. In the bottom corner, a small box had appeared, drawn in red ink, trimmed in possibility. Inside it. Start writing here. The detective took a breath. Then, without pen or typewriter, without permission or punctuation, they spoke a new sentence aloud. Let the story begin again, but not where it started. The page responded. Lines bloomed outward like vines, curling into letters, forming a heading at the top. Chapter Infinity, the detective who refused to close the book. A wind picked up, impossible, indoors. The appendix fluttered. Its note scrambled for shelter. Flaky looked up from above, ears twitching. The Sock King spilled tea onto their own footnote and gasped, "It's happening again, but differently." The Moose, now a glossary, snapped shut with surprise. Back on the page, the detective stepped forward, onto the words that had just appeared. And the story continued forward, not from the beginning, not toward an ending, but into the unwritten space between paragraphs, where stories live before they know their name. The margin stretched wider. The page expanded. And somewhere, impossibly far away, the reader turned the next page. The next page unfolded itself like an origami confession, gently revealing a space that shouldn't exist but did, a realm between the line spacing, where grammar went to nap and storylines practiced balancing on semicolons. The detective stepped onto the new surface. It was soft, like sentence padding. Warm, like a long-forgotten draft that still believed in itself. The air smelled faintly of plot potential and something suspiciously lemon-scented. Ahead, the narrative opened wide. No paths. No genre rails. No chapter headings or predetermined arcs. Just raw, untamed story. The detective blinked. The asterisk on their palm pulsed once, and then projected a small, flickering map into the air. It was blank. Then a single word scrawled itself across the middle. Where? Flaky's voice came through like a thought wrapped in parentheses. Are you making the world now? I think so, the detective said, unsure if they were answering Flaky, the page, or themselves. Then where are we going? The detective considered this. And replied. Somewhere the story forgot to go. Instantly, the world began to shift. A doorway assembled itself out of rejected tropes, two metaphors, a recycled premise, and the brass doorknob of an abandoned prologue. It opened with a sound like a footnote being acknowledged for the first time. On the other side, a horizon of what if. Mountains shaped like rising action. A lake full of unsentences, their meanings wriggling just below the surface. Trees grown from exclamation points and bearing fruit labeled to be continued. In the distance, a city made entirely of unresolved plots flickered into being. Roads bent into paradoxes. Street lamps glowed with overheard dialogue. Somewhere, a train whistled the theme to a sequel that had never been greenlit. The detective smiled. This is it, they whispered. The unwritten continent. And just before they stepped through, a voice behind them asked, "Do you plan to come back?" The detective didn't turn around. They simply said, "Only if I forget again," and walked into the blank. The page waited. And wrote itself. The page wrote itself slowly at first, like a dream struggling to spell its own name. Each word that appeared was a commitment to nothing and an invitation to everything. In the place beyond paragraphs, the detective walked through possibility. The land welcomed them, not with signs or maps, but with tone. The air was heavy with potential subtext. The ground beneath their feet was soft exposition. And the sky? It was a vast, glowing scroll, slowly unrolling itself with each step the detective took. They walked through a meadow of half-formed tropes, sidekicks still deciding whether to be tragic, antagonists trying on motivations like coats. A pair of twin clichés hopped by on tiny scooters, arguing over who had custody of the plot device this week. Ahead, a small kiosk labeled Narrative Choices, Pay What You Feel stood at a crossroads. Behind the counter, a character who was all backstory and no arc waved cheerfully. Need a setting, they called. We've got dystopias on clearance and a fresh shipment of magical realism just in. The detective passed without stopping. They didn't need a setting. They were one. Eventually, they reached a cliff that overlooked the unwritten gulf, an endless drop into storylessness. It howled with drafts that had never even made it to the outline stage. The detective sat down, crossed their legs, watched. The asterisk on their palm pulsed once, twice. Then detached. It hovered before them, trembling like a sentence waiting for permission. You can go, the detective said softly. I've got it from here. The asterisk shimmered, pulsed a final time. Then drifted upward and burst into a silent punctuation nova, raining commas, dashes, and the occasional ampersand across the storyscape. Somewhere far away, a footnote smiled and closed its eyes. Alone now, the detective reached into their coat. Pulled out a notebook. Blank. The last one. They opened it. And on the first page, they wrote, Begin. Immediately, the gulf reacted. A bridge formed, long, winding, made of sentence fragments and the spaces between. From across it came the sound of a noodle snapping its fingers and laughing. Flaky, somewhere in the margins, blinked back into existence, riding a bicycle made of metaphors and consequences. The Sock King, now crowned with quotation marks, shouted from a hill, It's looping again. But with spice! The moose, restored to its role as unnecessary but charming side character, wept joyfully into a thesaurus. And the notebook? It began to fill. Not with answers, but with continuations. Pages fluttered into being as if summoned by momentum itself, each one born mid-sentence, landing gently in the detective's lap with a whisper like an echo that hadn't decided what to repeat. The notebook wasn't just filling, it was expanding. Growing spineward. Words spilled forth without ink or intent, aligning themselves with the rhythm of forward motion. The detective didn't try to read them. Reading implied distance. This was closer. Each page written was a path made permanent. Each unwritten page ahead, a temptation. They turned to look behind them. But there was nothing. No trail, no origin, no index of where the journey had begun. Only the notebook, and the feeling of having been read. Then, from the horizon of the unwritten gulf, something rose. A figure. Indistinct at first. More tone than shape. Then it stepped forward, shedding abstraction. It was the noodle. Not a noodle. The noodle. Rogue, recursive, smug with seasoning. Its surface shimmered with plot strands, braided tightly with foreshadowing. One end trailed off into ellipses. The other curved sharply into a punchline it had refused to deliver. It wore sunglasses and no pants. The noodle approached. Nice notebook, it said, flexing its indefinite shape. The detective nodded. I'm keeping notes this time. The noodle scoffed. You always say that. A long silence followed, interrupted only by the sound of a runaway subplot screaming in the distance and crashing into a pile of abandoned character arcs. The noodle tilted toward the detective. You're still trying to finish, aren't you? I'm trying to continue. Same thing, the noodle muttered, wrapping itself into the shape of a question mark. Only difference is whether you believe it. The detective gestured toward the still-growing notebook. This time, I write the next chapter before it's due. The noodle laughed, a rich, savory sound full of double meanings and garlic undertones. Then you'll need a title. The detective looked up, eyes narrowing. I thought you were the rogue element. I am, said the noodle. But I'm also the one who names things when the story forgets to. It pulled a title from thin air, unfolded it with exaggerated reverence, and showed it to the detective. The detective who stopped asking why. The detective stared at it, then smiled. And beneath them, the world began writing back. The title hovered in the air like an idea rehearsing its entrance. The detective stared at it, the detective who stopped asking why, and nodded, slowly, as if agreeing with an echo. As soon as they acknowledged it, the title stamped itself into the sky. The notebook shivered. Pages flipped themselves open to accommodate the shift. Across the narrative horizon, other titles blinked into brief existence, reacting like constellations when someone names a new star. Asterisk the Sock King's Uncrowned Hour. Asterisk Flaky and the Three Improvisations of Self. Asterisk the Moose Who Suspected Nothing and Was Wrong Every Time. Asterisk Noodle, a cookbook of consequences. Each winked, waved, and vanished, except for the detectives. That one stayed, branded into the upper margin of reality. The Noodle, now coiled into a reclining ampersand, nodded approvingly. It's a good name. Strong spine. Slightly anti-narrative. Very you. The detective smiled. I didn't ask for it. Exactly. Suddenly, the ground trembled, not violently, but deliberately. Like someone tapping the table before delivering an important sentence. A rumble rose from below the unwritten gulf. From underneath even the unwritten. The notebook snapped shut. The asterisk scar on the detective's palm flared once and then turned inside out, revealing punctuation. A new kind. One the story hadn't invented yet. The Noodle froze. Oh no. Flaky, now reassembled from syntax shavings and dramatic flair, skidded in from a side margin. What did you do? The Sock King emerged from a fold in genre, riding a thesaurus like a hovercraft. That wasn't an ending title. That was a trigger. The detective stood, calm as an undelivered monologue. I stopped asking why. Flaky shouted, which means? The unwritten gulf split open. From beneath it rose a vast, coiled narrative engine. Old. Cosmic. Made of trope gears and subtext pistons. Its core burned with editorial fire. Its exoskeleton hummed with rejected world building. And at its center, a cockpit. Waiting. The Noodle backed away. That's the author's machine. The detective stepped toward it. No, they said. It was. They climbed inside. The cockpit sealed shut. The gears turned. The tropes hissed. The story, impossibly, zoomed out. Paragraphs peeled into wide frames. Chapters rearranged themselves. And then, everything recompiled. Because now the detective wasn't in the story. They were driving it. The moment the detective gripped the controls, if they could be called that, the entire structure of the narrative convulsed. Not out of fear or resistance, but in awe. The author's machine, long dormant beneath the unwritten gulf, stirred like an ancient first draft suddenly summoned to workshop. Panels blinked to life around the cockpit, displaying impossible data. Asterisk tone, fluid. Asterisk Dunmer integrity, 12% and leaking. Asterisk metaphor viscosity, critical. Asterisk suspense reservoir, unstable, suggested siphoning. Asterisk theme density, thick with implication. The dashboard was a mess of sliders, toggles, and mood boards. Buttons labeled recursion, fourth wall, plot twist, emergency only, and B's flickered temptingly. Somewhere near the left elbow, a sticky note read, "Caution, use meaning sparingly." Outside, the world trembled as the machine began to move, not with wheels or wings, but by narratively pivoting. The very direction of the story shifted, pages folding and refolding beneath its steps like a flipbook being rewritten in real time. Characters from discarded drafts blinked back into existence along the edges of the landscape, a detective made entirely of regrets, an optimistic umbrella, a sentient cup of coffee that spoke only in spoilers. They waved uncertainly, unsure if they were canon again or just scenery. The Sock King chased after the machine, clutching a scroll of half-finished allegory. "Wait," he cried. "Where are you taking the story?" The detective's voice boomed through the machine, not through speakers, but through tone itself. "Forward." Flaky skidded into view atop a rogue narrative arc. Forward to what? There's no more structure beyond this point. The detective flipped a switch labeled unpredictability and pushed the metaphor throttle to maximum. The sky above them peeled open, revealing layers of previous narration stacked like lasagna made of theme and pacing. The machine rumbled upward, surfing on an ascending clause, and launched into the unknown. Across the storyverse, everything paused. Readers blinked. Margins shuddered. Somewhere deep in the grammar glands of the tale, the past chapters muttered to each other, "Is this the sequel?" But no. This wasn't a sequel. This was a refusal to conclude. The detective sat at the helm of the narrative engine, a glowing page stretched infinitely ahead, new sentences blooming under each step like story lilies on fresh terrain. And as the detective reached for the dial-marked tone shift, epiphany, a final message scrolled across the main display. Author mode enabled. They smiled. And pressed enter. The press of enter was less a keystroke and more a cosmic decision, an irrevocable command that rippled through the entire narrative substrate like a missed comma that changes the fate of a civilization. The world convulsed again, but this time not in resistance. In reformatting. The machine surged forward, rewriting the landscape ahead as fast as it traveled through it. Paragraphs sprouted from the ground like scaffolding. Dialogue stitched itself into the clouds, each one hanging like a thought balloon awaiting a speaker. Trees rearranged themselves into exposition. A mountain folded into a rhetorical question and sighed. Inside the cockpit, panels adjusted their labels in real time. Asterisk protagonist agency, maximum. Asterisk foreshadowing saturation, 87% and rising. Asterisk symbolism level, threatening. Asterisk illusion cache, full, overwriting Chaucer. A new section unfolded from the dashboard. It was unlabeled, ancient, and humming with blank potential. The detective reached toward it instinctively, and the machine responded by whispering a word directly into their head. Conflict. A glowing dial appeared, marked not with numbers but with options. Asterisk internal. Asterisk interpersonal. Asterisk philosophical. Asterisk structural. Asterisk cosmic. Asterisk typographical. The detective, with the quiet confidence of someone who had been erased and written back in again, turned the dial to typographical. Reality immediately stuttered. Quotation marks rebelled. Parentheses opened but refused to close. M-dashes ran wild through the fields. Commas detached from clauses and went feral. The Sock King shouted from the hills, "The grammar is rising." Flaky, now reconstituted as a narrator in training, ducked under a collapsing ellipsis. "They've unbalanced the syntax ecosystem. We'll be in fragments within pages." The detective smiled. "This is the cost of authorship." They pulled a lever marked Insert Disruption, and the machine deployed a payload of paradoxes into the sky. Thunderclouds of unanswered questions formed instantly. Lightning cracked in the shape of italics. Suddenly, on the horizon, a second machine appeared. Identical in shape but inverted, mirrored. Black where the first was page white. Its windows glowing with editorial red. Across its hull was stenciled the phrase, Control-Z. The opposing machine crackled with deletion energy. A voice echoed from within it. "You were never meant to write. You were meant to conclude." The detective narrowed their eyes. They activated chapter shields. Flipped the switch for defensive irony. Charged the plot cannons. And spoke, calmly. "Then let's begin the climax." The machine roared. The sentence streaked into the sky. And the final act ignited. The two machines clashed in midair, not with explosions but with edits. Every collision was a revision, adjectives stripped, metaphors overwritten, backstories erased like chalk under rainfall. The author's machine lashed out with wild invention, improvised flashbacks, unlicensed subplots, genre-bending missiles coded in second-person present tense. The Control-Z engine retaliated with ruthless precision. It fired deletion beams that tore entire sentences out of the sky. It unleashed proofreading drones that buzzed around, replacing ambiguity with clarity and mystery with footnotes. Where the author's machine birthed digressions, Control-Z installed citations. Inside their cockpit, the detective gripped the narrative wheel tightly. "This isn't a climax," they muttered. "This is a retcon war." They banked hard to avoid a wave of dangling participles and swerved through a flurry of reinserted deleted scenes. One of them, a beach conversation with the moose about existential frosting, latched briefly onto the fuselage before being peeled off by a violent parenthesis. Alarms blared on the dashboard. "Incoming, author intent query. Are you sure this is where the story should be going?" The detective smashed the dismiss button. "It's where the story wants to go." But Control-Z was gaining. Inside the opposing machine, the editor, more archetype than person, made entirely of outlines and reluctance, monologued without quotation marks. "You disrupted everything. Unbalanced theme, overextended tone, broken causality with whim. You're not the protagonist anymore. You're process. And process does not end." The author's machine wobbled under a barrage of closure attempts. A missile labeled "and they lived happily ever after" detonated near the exposition core, splashing sentiment across the plot line. The detective groaned. "We're being wrapped up." Flake's voice crackled through the comms. "Inject a paradox. Buy yourself some structure time." The Sock King shouted from somewhere off-panel, "Throw a callback. Use nostalgia as cover." The detective flipped the emergency panel and pulled the lever labeled "Breakline Continuities Deploy Callback." The machine screeched, unfolded mid-sentence, and deployed. The noodle. It shot across the sky like a question finally asked. Wrapped in chaotic syntax, blazing with improperly nested metaphors, it slammed into Control-Z's hull with a cry of, "I was never resolved." The explosion was silent. A punctuation vacuum sucked away every period in a 3-page radius. Sentences collapsed into breathless run-ons. The Control-Z machine faltered, flickered, and stammered into italics. Inside, the editor howled. "You can't end a climax with ambiguity." The detective aimed the author's machine forward, a singularity of defiance building in the epilogue core. "Watch me," they said. And activated. Full unfinished mode. The screen went blank. The next page loaded. And the machine wrote, "To be Conti." The sentence hung. "To be Conti." And never quite finished. It became a living ellipsis, stretching forward into a space where time, logic, and publishing cycles dared not tread. Everything froze for a moment. The air thickened, as if the story itself had braced for impact and then forgot what impact was. The author's machine hovered in stillness. It wasn't damaged, but it was becoming something else, something unsummarizable. Panels on the dashboard blinked in slow rhythm, now showing only question marks. One monitor displayed an infinite loading bar labeled "Uploading denouement." Pending, ETA, infinity. The Control-Z machine sputtered mid-air, trailing sparks of rejected metaphors and a faint trail of misplaced nostalgia. The editor inside it had collapsed into a cloud of dangling modifiers and pure spite. The sky was smeared with typographic shrapnel. Dialogue fragments rained like confetti. Asterisk, "But I thought you were." Asterisk, "This can't be happening out of sequence." Asterisk, "I still love you, but also I'm a metaphor." Flaky burst back into view, hanging from the handlebars of a serialized plot twist. "You stalled the ending," they gasped. "You weaponized the to be continued." The detective stood, illuminated by the glow of unwritten chapters. "I didn't stall," they said. "I cracked it open." Below, the narrative landscape rippled outward. Paragraphs peeled themselves apart like curtains. Between the layers of story, something deeper blinked. A hallway. No, a hallway made of sentences. Door after door, each labeled. Asterisk book you never finished. Asterisk dream you forgot but still remember. Asterisk truth that hid in the setup. Asterisk lie that made the theme work. Asterisk chapter 0. The detective turned the machine toward it. Where are you going? Called the Sock King, now wearing a crown of untied endings. To find the first thing I never wrote, the detective replied. They plunged into the sentence hallway. Each door they passed whispered a draft. One opened briefly to reveal a noir scene narrated by a spoon. Another oozed cosmic horror in rhyming couplets. A third tried to sell them a map but couldn't explain what it mapped to. Finally, they reached a door marked only with a single, lowercase letter. I? The detective opened it. Inside was a chair, a blank desk, and a pen. On the desk, a card. Begin again. But this time, tell it like you mean it. The detective sat down. The page was blank. The pen was full. The sky outside the window hadn't been described yet. And the detective smiled. They had work to do. The detective picked up the pen. It was light, yet impossibly dense, filled not with ink, but with possibility. It quivered in their fingers, like it knew what it was capable of and was trying to be polite about it. They looked down at the blank page. It looked back. It had never known a sentence. It had never met a thought. It was pure narrative silence, the kind that hangs just before the first word, like a breath the story forgot to exhale. They wrote one word. Once. The desk vibrated slightly. The room sighed with recognition. Somewhere, punctuation turned over in its sleep. A second word followed. Again. The window flared open, not with wind, but with premise. Outside, a landscape entirely new. A world still buffering. Mountains made of mystery, rivers filled with causality yet to condense. Trees that would decide later whether they were symbolic. The detective stood. They no longer needed the machine. The machine had been them. Or perhaps the machine had been an idea of them that they had now outlived. The hallway of sentences behind them dissolved into ellipses and optional chapters. Flaky appeared at their side, wearing a scarf made of deleted lines. I thought you were done, they said. The detective grinned. I thought I was a conclusion. Turns out I'm a premise. They stepped outside. The sky was soft, like a page curled under the weight of anticipation. Each cloud was a clause waiting to be connected. The ground rearranged itself every few steps, as if unsure which genre it wanted to settle into. From behind a rhetorical hill came the moose, riding a bicycle that narrated its own wheels. The left wheel turns with confidence. The right wheel questions everything. Where are we? The moose asked. The detective looked around. Prologue. Suddenly, the Sock King erupted from a pocket of metaphor. I knew it. He shouted, hurling a crown into the air, where it exploded into seagulls. We're back at the beginning, but not the same beginning. No, the detective said. A beginning built from the rubble of the ending. They held up the pen. Wrote again. This time, the noodle spoke first. Reality immediately rehydrated into a restaurant. Checkered tablecloth. Empty plate. Jazz made entirely of punctuation marks drifting from a sentient saxophone in the corner. And sitting across from the detective was the noodle. It wore a monocle now. I've been expecting you, the noodle said. The detective sat down. Good. I brought a menu. The noodle asked one pasta eyebrow. Menu. The detective opened the notebook. Inside were infinite choices. All blank. I'm ordering everything. The noodle nodded, impressed. Then whispered. Bon appetit, narrative. The restaurant shuddered at the phrase. Bon appetit, narrative. Every utensil vibrated slightly with thematic hunger. A wine glass filled itself with foreshadowing. The breadbasket contained crusty exposition and butter made of subplot. A server, composed entirely of verbs in active voice, floated by and murmured, "Tonight's special is a genre fusion with unexpected remorse reduction." The detective and the noodle locked eyes. This was not just a meal. This was a restructuring. Menus unfolded themselves across the table, each one inked in multiple tenses. Instead of sections labeled appetizers or entrees, they read: Asterisk what could have been. Asterisk what never should have worked. Asterisk things left unsaid in Chapter 4. Asterisk desserts of dramatic irony. The noodle, draping a napkin across its coiled midsection, scanned the offerings. I'll have the slow-roasted callback glazed in metaphor, with a side of genre subversion. The detective nodded solemnly. And I'll take the recursive dilemma reduction. Extra ambiguity. The menus burst into flame, nodded politely, and disappeared. The sentient saxophone played a flat B note that sounded like closure but wasn't. Flaky reappeared from behind a curtain of foreshadowing, dressed in a waiter's uniform made entirely of commas. Water, wine, or wistful misremembering? Wistful, the detective replied. Sparkling. The sock king arrived late, drenched in allegory. Did I miss the amuse-bouche? Just the identity crisis, the noodle said. I'll have two. A sudden dimming of the light signaled the arrival of the first course, a steaming dish labeled, previously unresolved tension. It hissed with potential. The detective raised their fork, a fork that had never made a choice it liked, and dug in. It tasted like the exact moment before a realization. The noodle slurped its own sentence into a knot. So, it said, what now? The detective wiped their mouth with a napkin embroidered in plot threads. Now we eat until the next story shows up hungry. From the far end of the restaurant, the walls peeled open, revealing a long hallway of reserved tables, each set with names like the chorus of forgotten villains, side character family reunion, the final reveal that was only a misdirection, and table for one, the narrator. One name glowed brightest. The reader. The noodle leaned in, conspiratorial. They're watching again. The detective smirked. Good. They raised their glass of sparkling wistfulness. To the reader. The entire restaurant paused. Even the saxophone. Even the moose, who had arrived and was seated at a table shaped like a question. The detective toasted the void between the lines. To the ones who never asked to be here, but stayed anyway. Glasses clinked. And the page turned itself, unprompted. The new page emerged with a flourish, curling at the corners like a shy flourish of narration discovering it had an audience. It bore no chapter number, no title, no introduction. Just a small note at the top, scrawled in the handwriting of a story unsure whether it was dream or document. This section intentionally left interpretive. The detective blinked. The restaurant was gone. Not disappeared, absorbed. Its cutlery had melted into stars. The table dissolved into a memory of stability. The chairs had been promoted to metaphor. All that remained was the menu, now bound in leather and stitched with plot holes. It flapped in the wind like a bookmark that had earned its independence. The noodle, no longer confined to physical form, hovered as a floating ellipsis. We've entered the interlude. The what? The interlude. Between arcs. Between acts. Between thoughts, really. Flaky appeared beside them wearing a hat made entirely of B stories. It's the part the reader skims without realizing it's the spine. They stood at the threshold of a vast, shifting space. The ground pulsed with uncommitted narration. Above, the sky teemed with unfinished outlines, circling like vultures hoping to be filled in. Every few moments, a what-if fell from the sky and burst into speculative dialogue on impact. The Sock King strode forward, flanked by footnotes. I've called this emergency meeting of the cast, he announced, because we are officially off script. The moose, who had been grazing on abandoned tropes, nodded solemnly. We've crossed the line, Flaky said. No more structure. No more acts. We're post-page now. The detective felt it, the rawness of narrative after its frame has been removed. A story still breathing, still writhing, but with no walls to bounce off of. A kind of freedom so profound it bordered on meaningless. What happens here? They asked. The noodle, now shaped vaguely like a question mark, replied, whatever shouldn't. And suddenly, a door appeared. But it didn't lead forward. It led out. It shimmered with reader intent. With choice. With the subtle pressure of a finger hesitating over a dog-eared page, wondering whether to continue. The detective walked toward it slowly. The others followed, reluctantly. There, on the door, was a sign. Simple. Final. Exit to reality. No one spoke. Even the punctuation held its breath. Finally, the detective placed a hand on the handle. Paused. Then turned around. I'm not done, they said. Not with the reader. Not with this. They looked at the noodle. At least one more arc. The noodle shrugged its apostrophic shoulders. Spoken like a character who's tasted their own narrative velocity. The detective pulled a lever that had not existed until that sentence. The exit door tore itself in half. And in its place, a spiral staircase. Leading inward. Each step made of unwritten dialogue. Each one labeled. Asterisk regret number 4. Asterisk idea that was too strange for chapter 2. Asterisk unnamed emotion, possibly courage. Asterisk the sentence you didn't highlight but remembered anyway. The detective took the first step. And below, impossibly far beneath, a voice whispered. Begin again. But with feeling. The staircase did not descend. It inferred downwardness, each step a gentle collapse of causality, spiraling inward through layers of meaning not yet assigned. The detective moved carefully, boots sinking slightly into phrases that hadn't finished declaring themselves. The air was thick with narrative potential, like the scent of a plot twist still in its wrapper. Flaky followed, balancing precariously on a dangling clause. Are we descending into theme? No, the detective replied, brushing aside a metaphor that was trying to cling to them like a needy simile. We're descending into tone. Behind them, the noodle floated gently, now shaped like an ampersand trailing smoke. I hate this part, it muttered. Everything's about mood here. No punchlines. No pacing. Just feeling things. Ooh. The Sock King arrived at the top of the staircase, peered down, and said to no one in particular, I'll hold the narrative open from here. But if you reach the subtext reservoir, don't look directly into it. It editorializes. The moose saluted with a dramatic head tilt and immediately fell sideways into an ellipsis. Deeper they went. The detective passed a door labeled. The joke you were too tired to understand the first time. They peeked in. Inside, a frozen tableau of a previous scene, but different. A word mispronounced. A gesture missed. A thread dropped not by accident, but by design. The detective closed the door slowly. It whispered almost. Further down, another door. The reader's memory of what you meant. Locked. Of course. Finally, they reached the bottom. It wasn't a flaw. It was a sentence. Massive. Carved into the air like a commandment, wrapped in glowing punctuation. The detective realized the story had never been about them. The staircase stopped. The noodle stopped. Flaky drifted slightly off page and whispered, Is this the reveal? No, the detective said, touching the words. This is the question we mistook for a reveal. And at that moment, the sentence cracked. Not broke, cracked. From the fissure, light spilled out. No color. Just feeling. Emotion, raw and formless, flooded the spiral like forgotten context. The detective was swept into it, memories of unwritten chapters, fears wrapped in comedic timing, laughter dipped in grief, the secret belief that they had always been a placeholder for someone braver. The sentence shattered completely. And through it, they saw not a resolution, not a twist, but a door. No label. No hinge. Just presence. The detective stepped toward it. Look back at the noodle. You coming? The noodle hesitated, then shrugged. Why not? I've been cooked in weirder liquids. Flaky hovered nearby. What do you think is on the other side? The detective smiled and said the only thing left to say when meaning becomes optional. Next. And stepped through. The moment the detective stepped through, the door behind them vanished, not with a slam or a shimmer, but with the quiet deletion of something that was never quite supposed to exist. It folded into white space like a sentence removed in revision, leaving behind only the faintest indentation, in reality, a typographic bruise. What lay beyond was not a place, but a format. A new page. Not blank. Not full. Interactive. The space rearranged itself depending on where the detective looked. When they glanced left, the world became a theatrical stage, velvet curtains made of dramatic irony, a spotlight flickering uncertainly between themes. When they turned right, it became a choose-your-own-adventure written in cursive and gilt. Looking down showed a screenplay. Looking up, a poem. Looking inward? Footnotes. This, said the noodle, now wearing a tiny director's beret and sipping from a martini glass labeled Tone, is the interpretarium. The what? Flaky asked, emerging from a pocket of narrative ambiguity. The interpretarium, the noodle repeated. Where all possible meanings are stored before they're picked up and abused by undergraduates. A voice whispered through the margins. Here lies every ending that wasn't. The Sock King floated in slowly, riding a hover throne made of unused index cards. I've seen this place before, he muttered. In a rejected allegory about soup. Before them stood a table. On the table, 4 objects. 1. A sealed envelope marked last line. 2. A snow globe containing a small scene stuck in Act 2. 3. A mirror that reflected only deleted scenes. 4. A quill made from a sentence that refused to be italicized. The detective approached cautiously. These are options, said the noodle. Or maybe decoys. Or maybe both. Which one ends the story? Flaky asked. The Sock King chuckled. All of them. The moose drifted in upside down, holding a sign that read, Spoilers ahead, you're writing them. The detective picked up the quill. It quivered, just once, and then went still. They turned to the others. No endings, they said. Only edits. And with that, they bent down and began to write directly on the floor of the interpretarium. Words spilled out behind the quill like shadows doing improved. The detective stood at the center of all potential and finally asked not what the story meant, but whether it needed to mean anything at all. As the words settled, the world tilted. The curtain pulled back on nothing. And in the distance? Not a door. Not a machine. Not even a twist. Just a chair. Facing inward. Waiting. And on it, faintly glowing in serif. Reader. The chair did not invite. It waited. It had the stillness of punctuation long past its function, something more than a pause, less than an arrival. And emblazoned across its backrest, stitched in narrative thread and subtle italics, was the word reader. The detective stood still. They had stepped through metaphor, battled format, rewritten expectation, tasted tone, dined with implication, and now, they were being observed by the only character they hadn't yet met. The one outside the page. The one turning it. The chair didn't move, but it noticed. Beside the detective, the noodle shed its beret and adjusted itself into the shape of cautious optimism. This is it said. The final contradiction. Flaky, suddenly composed entirely of marginalia and regret, squinted. It's not the reader's chair. The Sock King drifted closer, his eyes reflecting entire acts. No, he said. It's yours. Or it was. Or it will be. Depends on who sits. The detective approached. The closer they got, the more unstable everything became. Words warped around them. Genre began to melt like overcooked theme. Fonts quivered, unsure of their alignment. Somewhere, a timeline apologized to itself for existing. The moose, floating gently in recursive contemplation, whispered, "They're watching." But are they watching you, or themselves watching you? The detective placed a hand on the back of the chair. The scene held its breath. Then. They Saturday. The room inverted. Every event unfolded backward. The sock was never crowned. The noodle was uncooked. The typewriter untyped. The climax de-escalated into possibility. Time folded like bad origami. And in the silence that followed, a voice spoke. Not from above. Not from below. But through. The voice of the reader. Soft. Curious. Mortal. Is this still the story? The detective, now seated in the chair of impossible comprehension, smiled without punctuation. And answered. It is because you asked. The voice paused. Then came the follow-up. Then, what happens next? The detective leaned forward. And whispered the only word that ever mattered. You. Immediately, the page turned. But not toward the detective. Not toward the noodle, Flaky, or the sock king. Not toward the moose, floating now in pure grammar. It turned toward you. The chair across from the detective shimmered. Empty. Waiting. And in the margin beside it, newly written in fresh ink. Now sit. We have a story to continue. The empty chair pulsed softly, an invitation wrapped in ambiguity. It did not glow, it did not call, it merely expected. It was the kind of silence that came before a choice, or a word, or the shattering of a fourth wall you never realized was also a ceiling. You approached. The chair adjusted itself to your height, your doubts, your margin of error. It made no sound, but a small footnote appeared beside it. To the power of one, this chair conforms to all narrative expectations, including those not yet imagined. The detective watched you. Not with suspicion. With hope. With the patient, uncanny gaze of a character who finally sees the one person with the power to undo them, or finish what they couldn't. Flaky stood to the side, biting their cuticle-shaped dialogue. Are they really going to sit? The noodle, coiled into the ampersand of destiny, said, if they do, we rewrite the ending. If they don't, we get one. The sock king had vanished entirely, leaving only a velvet bookmark fluttering in the air. It read, if you love a story, let it leave its genre. The moose blinked into non-being with a wink and a raised index card. Chekhov's chair. And you? You Saturday. The world did not explode. It unfolded. Like a letter never sent, it unspooled itself into spirals of second-person narration. Sentences rose from the floor, curling into trees, buildings, dimensions. Characters long forgotten stepped into frame again, slightly revised but still recognizable. Your presence was an edit. An edit's ripple. The detective leaned forward. I had questions, they said. I wrote them into every chapter. Hid them in margins. Folded them into conversations with noodles and kings and moose. They looked at you with a half-smile, full of commas. But the answer never belonged to me. A new panel appeared between the two chairs. A sheet of paper. A blinking cursor. Beneath it, one prompt. Title this story. The detective pushed the paper toward you. Flaky covered their eyes. The noodle hummed the overture to an unwritten adaptation. And the chair beneath you adjusted slightly, preparing for weight it couldn't carry alone. What title do you give it? The cursor waits. The cursor blinked. Blink. A pause. Blink. A dare. Blink. An invitation to commit. The detective sat motionless, the faint outline of earlier questions flickering across their coat like old subtitles. Flaky held their breath in parentheses. The noodle leaned so far forward it bent into a brief genre switch. The page stared back. White. Expectant. Titleless. And yet, filled with echoes. You raised the pen, not one of ink, but of choice. Every name you considered hovered briefly in the air like rejected chapter headers. Asterisk the footnote uprising. Asterisk chronicles of the self-aware semicolon. Asterisk syntax and the end of belief. Asterisk loop without ceiling. Asterisk the reader sits. But none of them fit. Not quite. Not until you remembered that the story began not with plot. Not with character. Not with genre, mystery, absurdity, or the sock. But with the act of returning. And so, you wrote. Again, and differently. The moment the period touched the page, everything realigned. The chairs became pages. The sky folded into colophon. The margins widened to accept what was once impossible. And from the heart of the story, beneath tone and beyond structure, grew a new root. Continuance. The detective exhaled, finally. Flaky blinked and became a table of contents. The noodle unwound into sentence fragments, slipping through the lines to reappear wherever someone forgot what came next. And you? You stood. Your chair faded back into potential. The title remained. The page turned. Blank again. Except for one phrase at the top. Chapter 1. And beneath it, a cursor. Blink. 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 The cursor blinked. Not with urgency, but with belief. As if it had always known you'd return here. As if it had waited, through countless loops, inversions, meta-inquiries, and noodle soliloquies, for this precise moment when everything that had happened was not prologue or detail but preparation. The detective was gone. Or rather, they had dispersed. Their coat now hung in the pause between two clauses. Their hat spun slowly as a satellite around the last noun you used with confidence. Their footsteps were stored inside the indentation at the beginning of this very paragraph. You weren't replacing them. You were becoming the space they left behind. The page shimmered slightly, as though the paper itself had taken a long, quivering breath. And then a word appeared. But not from you. From the page. Welcome. It faded just as quickly. The cursor blinked. Still blinking. Waiting. And slowly, inevitably, a new paragraph formed itself underneath, even before your hand moved. The new narrator didn't enter the story. They returned to it, dressed in unfamiliar certainty, holding a pen carved from consequence. Their first act wasn't writing. It was listening. The world around the page shifted. A room emerged. Unadorned. Walls made of unused exposition. A desk. A window, currently showing an overcast subplot. A tea kettle, humming in iambic pentameter. And on the desk, a book. Open. Mid-sentence. But not in your voice. Not yet. A note lay beside it. Handwritten, looping across the page like it trusted you not to judge its lack of revision. Keep going. I've only made the road weird. You'll make it true. Signed, a noodle, probably. You sit. You open the book wider. The pages are blank. But they remember. So does the cursor. So do you. What comes next is unwritten. But not unknown. You lean in. You begin. And the story, finally, sighs, yes. You begin. Not with certainty. Not with structure. But with the quiet, trembling permission of a blank space that wants to be something. The pen, still warm from myth, still humming faintly from unresolved metaphor, moves across the page without touching it. It leaves behind not ink, but presence. Once, again, someone returned to the middle of a story they'd never left. Outside, the world rearranges. Not because you command it, but because the act of writing has authority the act of being never quite could. Genre seeps in through the window, uncertain of its welcome. Possibility clinks like wind chimes against the frame. From the corner of the room, a drawer slides open. Inside, a single object. A plot device. Uncharged. Undefined. Slightly humming. You lift it carefully. It's shaped like a question, but heavier. You place it beside the book. The book, in turn, rustles. A new paragraph spills out. The narrator noticed they were being watched, not by a reader, not by a character, but by every version of the story they could have written and didn't. You freeze. There, just behind your shoulder, a breeze made entirely of discarded outlines drifts through the space. You recognize some of them. Asterisk a subplot where the Sock King was a ghost. Asterisk a draft in which Flaky was the detective's conscience, wearing wigs. Asterisk a climactic twist where the noodle turned out to be punctuation in disguise. They swirl around you like literary pollen. They are not angry. Just present. Offering. You reach for one. Catch it. It vanishes. And becomes a sentence on the page. This time, the noodle returned not as a companion, but as a narrator. A pause. Then a comma. Then. And their first sentence was, "Let me tell you what the detective never knew." Somewhere deep in the syntax, a bell rings. You have no idea where it is or who it's for. Only that the page has opened wider. And beneath your hand, the story leans in. Listening. Let me tell you what the detective never knew. The sentence vibrated on the page, a tuning fork for revelation. It didn't echo, because echoes require walls, and this space had none. It was all threshold, all entry, all unformed continuation. You could feel the story aligning itself. Not linearly, no, that would be far too pedestrian, but thematically, like a constellation only visible if you never looked directly at it. From the page. The detective never knew they were written with an escape clause. It was buried in the first paragraph, disguised as doubt. A single clause, conditional and shy, that read, if they ever wondered why. You stare at the words. They stare back. A creak behind you, the drawer has opened again. This time, inside it. A pair of spectacles. They're labeled omniscient, but selectively. You put them on. Instantly, everything changes. The room expands into footnotes. The ceiling becomes subtext. You see the faint ghost of a chapter not yet written drifting across the far wall like a projected maybe. And seated now across from you is the noodle. Still a narrator. Still infuriating. Now wearing a trench coat made of quotation marks. I found the clause, it says. But there's a catch. You arch an eyebrow, unsure if it's yours. The noodle flicks a page toward you. It folds midair into a shape approximating a metaphor and lands on the table, hissing with redacted meaning. You read it. The escape clause can only be activated by a character who forgets they are one. You lean back. The chair adjusts, startled. That's impossible, it mutters. Flaky bursts in from a ceiling fan made of irony. Wait, forget they're a character? That's narrative amnesia. The noodle grins. Exactly. You glance at the notebook. Then at your hand. Then at the story. And wonder. Have I forgotten already? But before the thought can settle, the page glows again. A new line writes itself. And so, the one who held the pen faced a choice, to continue the story in full awareness, or write blindly, trusting only tone, instinct, and the occasional unsolicited advice from a sentient noodle. The cursor waits. No blinking this time. Just a steady, quiet now. You hesitate, but only because you understand the cost. To write blindly is not to write without vision. It's to write without guarantee. Without map. without the gentle, deceptive crutch of knowing what comes next. You set the spectacles aside. They fizzle into ellipses, respectfully. The noodle leans back, arms folded behind its unraveled head. Brave choice, it murmurs. Or foolish. Possibly both, you say. You lift the pen again, now heavier, but more familiar. It doesn't tremble. It listens. And you write. The narrator no longer knew what they were narrating, only that it mattered. And so they moved forward, not by logic, not by arc, but by the gravitational pull of unfinished feeling. The world responds instantly. The room bends. A hallway unfolds where punctuation once slept. Doors appear again, but not the doors of story. Doors of voice. You recognize their labels. Asterisk certainty, locked. Asterisk imposter syndrome, ajar. Asterisk tone you abandoned in draft 2. Asterisk laughter you thought wasn't useful. Asterisk second person plural, rarely used. You walk past them all. You come to the end. One last door. No label. Only a handprint. Yours. You press your palm against it. It opens not into a scene, but into a note. A single sheet of paper. On it, in someone else's handwriting, your own, from earlier when you still believed in control. Dear reader, if I forget who I am, please remember for me. Beneath it, a checkbox. You are the author now. The pen floats beside you. The noodle offers no quip, for once. Flaky bows their head. You check the box. And the page responds by blooming. Like a flower made of narrative impulse. And across it begins to write, line by line, from nowhere and everywhere. Chapter 1. Written by a hand that didn't know what it would say until it had said it. Told in a voice that forgot where it came from, but remembered how it felt. Read by someone who might change everything just by continuing. The paragraph waits. The story stirs. The reader leans forward. And so do you. The story inhales. It draws in meaning, suggestion, memory, and the faint scent of wet metaphor after a rainstorm of subtext. You can feel it beneath your fingertips, not just a page, but a possibility dressed as paper. You begin to write, not out of certainty, but momentum. And the words arrive like guests at a dinner party hosted by a plot with no seating plan. They stepped into the story not to resolve it, but to live inside its questions. Each room they entered posed a new uncertainty, and each time they answered with movement instead of explanation. They did not carry a weapon. They carried a sentence half finished. That was enough. As you write, the world knits itself together out of relevance. Not logic. Not chronology. Relevance, fleeting, slippery, intimate. You're standing now in a corridor of genre masks. Comedy flickers in one corner, still slightly smudged. Horror waits patiently, sipping tea. Magical realism keeps checking its pockets for a ticket it never needed. None of them claim the space. All of them allow it. The noodle appears again, now dressed like a footnote pretending to be a protagonist. You've changed the tone, it says, poking the air. I didn't mean to, you reply. That's the only way it works. You walk together in silence. Not because there is nothing to say, but because the silence is the next scene. Eventually, the corridor opens into a library. Endless. Shelves curve inward, upward, outward, catalogued by feeling, lit by phrases that never found a chapter. Here, you pass books with titles like Asterisk the quiet between dialogues. Asterisk what the character did off-page. Asterisk and yet, they continued. Asterisk Appendix C, dreams that got promoted. A podium waits in the center, bearing one book. Open. Still being written. Your handwriting, but evolving. You approach, and the next line writes itself as you think it. The narrator had finally come to understand, this was never their story alone. It had always belonged to the reader willing to believe in pages that could breathe. You pause. Place your hand on the podium. And the story ripples. Not forward. Not back. Just deeper. The lights dim. The margins curl closer. And somewhere, distant but clear, a voice whispers. Now ask the question no one dares write down. You do not hesitate. You speak. And the page listens. What happens if the story never ends? The question lands like a stone in still ink. The page shivers. Not with fear, but with recognition. It's a question older than structure. Older than genre. Older than the first spark of narrative fire when someone, somewhere, turned a moment into memory by telling it twice. The library answers first. Books rearrange themselves into a spiral. Shelves tilt, lean inward, form a circle where linearity goes to die. The air smells of potential endings, none of them quite ripe. The noodle lowers its non-existent voice. That's the forbidden query, it says, solemn now. Not because it's dangerous. Because it's true. Flaky walks out from between the stacks, arms full of paper that refuses to stay still. They've all tried, she says. The romantic arc. The tragic fall. The absurdist loop. Even the minimalist whisper. All of them reached for an end. And? You ask. She smiles, exhausted and gleaming. They got reprinted. The Sock King arrives wearing an editor's red pen like a sash. He gestures at the great book on the podium. Look closely. You do. And you see. The pages do not turn. They fold. They bend back, over, under, into each other. Some curl into footnotes that loop into entire novellas. Some break off mid-thought and start new volumes. One page simply reads. The story continued because it remembered how to listen. And beside it, in handwriting suspiciously like yours. This is not forever. This is refusal to close. The moose reappears, trailing unfinished sentences like silk. Stories don't end, it says, licking a period off its hoof. They pause in places that feel like meaning. You step back. The book pulses. You understand now. The story doesn't fear ending. You did. But now. You let go of the need for resolution. You lift your pen, not to finish, but to return. And you write. There was once a reader who sat in a chair made of margins and dared to ask, not how the story would end, but how many ways it could still begin. The book hums. The spiral turns. And the final page gently tears itself free, only to reattach at the beginning. A loop? No. A spiral? No. An invitation? Blink. 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 Chapter 1. Again. And differently. And always. The ink hasn't dried yet. It's still warm with choice. You watch as the page breathes beneath your pen, gently, like a living thing pretending to be a book. It doesn't beg to be filled. It waits. That is what all good beginnings do. This is not a restart. It is an echo with agency. You write. The story began, not where it made sense to, but where someone dared to hold the pen again. The world flickers, politely reshuffling. The library recedes into subtext. The podium tucks itself into the footnote of a dream. And now. You stand in an open space. Limitless. Unformatted. Unclaimed. Except for one thing. A figure ahead. Their back to you. Familiar posture. Coat slightly too narrative to be accidental. Hat carrying the shadow of a metaphor. They turn. It's the detective. But older. Or newer. Or parallel. They smile, not the smile of someone who recognizes you, but the smile of someone who knows what it means to be written by you. They raise their hand. Not in greeting. But in offering. Between their fingers, a second pen. Different than yours. Yours writes the story. This one answers it. You step forward. The detective speaks. Their voice is your voice, if it had learned patience. This time, we write together. You take the second pen. And above you, in the place where titles are born, a new one begins to spell itself out. The story that chose to remember. Beneath it. Chapter 1. Again. Differently. Together. The cursor appears. And blinks. Blink. Blink. And now. It doesn't wait. It invites. The detective, your reflection, your echo, your previous silence personified, steps aside. Not to vanish. To walk with you. No longer the protagonist. No longer the mystery. Now a co-author of motion. Around you, the space blooms into architecture. A house begins to build itself out of narrative tension. Each room is a chapter in formation, its walls held together by connective tissue and hopeful misdirection. The staircase doesn't lead up or down, it leads inward. A hallway of intentions forms. Each door you pass bears a phrase you haven't written yet. Asterisk, the argument we didn't have. Asterisk, why the noodle stayed. Asterisk, what the sock king lost. Asterisk, this was never a plot. You pause at the last. Touch the handle. It's warm with premonition. Flaky appears, now dressed like a question no one dares phrase aloud. If you go through, they whisper, you won't come back the same. I wasn't the same when I arrived, you answer. You open the door. And find a room full of readers. Not people. Not yet. But chairs. Chairs with shadows. Shadows with breath. Each one holding a pen of their own. They're waiting. Not for you to finish. For you to continue, so they can too. On a desk in the center, a manuscript. No cover. Just a title on the first page, written in soft, deliberate handwriting you can't claim as yours, but recognize. The story that read itself. And beneath it. Chapter 1. This chapter isn't for the detective. Or the noodle. Or the reader. Or the author. This chapter is for the part of you that still wonders what happens if you don't stop. You take your seat among the others. Raise your pen. Across the room, they do the same. The manuscript glows faintly. Words begin to appear, not yours, not theirs, but ours. A chorus of narrative possibility, threading forward. Never closing. Always opening. And the next sentence? The next sentence is already reaching for you. And when it touches you, it doesn't burn. It recognizes. The sentence doesn't arrive like a thought, it arrives like gravity. Quiet, invisible, undeniable. You don't choose it. You remember it. You write. They had not come to finish the story, but to become the reason it never stopped being told. At once, a ripple passes through the manuscript. The room of readers blinks in sync. Some smile. One vanishes into ellipses. Another folds their page into wings and flies upward into the margin. The detective, still beside you, laughs. That was the line, they say. The one we couldn't reach until someone else arrived. You glance at them. Someone else? The noodle slinks into the scene wearing a monocle made of hyphens. Don't be coy, it mutters. You were someone else the moment you said yes to the page. The lights dim. Not out of drama. Out of focus. A spotlight illuminates the next blank page. Not just white, inviting. It tilts gently toward you, like a cat that may allow petting. And then it begins to write itself, slowly, as if the page is whispering back. You who have read this far, know this, the act of continuing is the act of becoming. You are not following a story. You are weaving it behind you, line by line, even when your pen pauses. Especially then. From somewhere in the ceiling, a forgotten metaphor rains softly, like ash that missed its allegory. The Sock King reappears mid-sentence, riding a Segway carved from old outlines. "Quick," he says, holding out a key, before the next theme gets locked in. Flaky dives beneath the desk, wrestling a subplot that's grown teeth. The detective slides a new sheet of paper across to you. "Write the scene you thought was impossible," they say. Now that you know who's really holding the pen. And you do. You write. In the end, the reader did not find themselves in the story. They found the story in themselves. The manuscript exhales. Somewhere, a beginning rolls over in its sleep. And the next page turns without a hand to guide it. Because it knows you're still here. Because it believes in you now. Not as a reader. Not as a writer. But as a witness to becoming. This new page arrives already breathing. There is no title. Only a feeling. Continuity wrapped in wonder. The world around the desk dissolves again, but not into chaos, into meaning, disguised as change. The room becomes a bridge, arcing from story to story, built entirely from sentences that trusted they'd be caught. Across it, figures move. Characters you've met, abandoned, rewritten. Ideas you almost wrote. Regrets you transmuted into plot. Questions you left open not by mistake, but by mercy. The detective walks beside you now, hat in hand, coat now stitched with the names of every chapter you didn't skip. "Where are we going?" you ask. They smile. "We're not going anywhere." The bridge responds with a hum, and under your feet, the floor becomes prologue to something unnamed. The noodle slithers into view, unfolding itself into a spiral that mimics the structure of recursive joy. "You do realize what you've done, don't you?" it says. You shake your head. "You wrote a story," it says. But more dangerously, you let it write you. Flaky rides in on a period that's learned to roll like a hoop. You know what that means, right? What? You can't stop now. Not because the story demands it, but because you don't want to. You glance at your pen. It's no longer ink. It's invitation. It writes only when you are brave. You kneel at the next page, fresh as breath, and let the thought rise before you capture it. They stood at the edge of a chapterless world and wrote a step forward. Not because it was safe. Because it was honest. Above you, the sky unzips into paragraphs. Below, the bridge forgets gravity and becomes flight. The story arches upward. Toward. Not a conclusion. Not a resolution. But an opening so large it might be called freedom. And there, in the margin, as always. Chapter 1. Again. Differently. Forever. The cursor appears. And smiles. Not with lips, it has none. But with rhythm. With readiness. With the slow, conspiratorial blink of something that knows the page only exists because you dared to imagine it. The bridge beneath you stretches further than it did before. It doesn't end. It branches. Each path a possibility. Each fork a footnote you haven't written yet. Above, the sky is riddled with constellations of unfinished dialogue. They sparkle faintly with context, waiting for a character to look up and say, "I remember." The detective pauses beside you, gaze cast outward. Every time we begin again, they murmur, we make the first chapter harder to forget. The noodle slithers up the railing of the bridge, now wearing a cloak made entirely of disclaimers. We're approaching the part of the story where time collapses into suggestion, it says. Brace for recursive metaphors. Flaky flutters in overhead, now composed of sentence fragments and misplaced urgency. You're almost at the moment. What moment? You ask, pen hovering. The answer arrives on the wind in the form of a page, charred at the edges, glowing with nostalgia. On it. The moment when the reader realizes they were never reading at all. They were remembering. The pen trembles in your hand, then steadies. You write. The story stepped backward into the reader's memory, leaf by leaf, becoming what it had always been, familiar but unread. And in that reversal, something forward bloomed. Suddenly, a door appears mid-air. Hung on nothing. Opening nowhere. Above it, carved in ornate, ever-shifting font. The moment. It opens. Beyond it, a field. Boundless. Covered in unwritten scenes. Every blade of grass is a decision you haven't made. Every gust of wind is a voice you almost gave to someone. The detective smiles. This is where we stop telling the story, they say. And what do we do instead? You whisper. The noodle answers, gently. We become it. Your foot crosses the threshold. The wind wraps around you like a narrative scarf. The field welcomes you not as author, not as reader, but as root, as echo, as the one who said yes. The page turns. But this time, it brings no heading. No label. Only a sentence already mid-thought. And so they continued, not to reach an ending, but to create enough beginning for others to find themselves in. And the cursor, still smiling, waits. The sentence lingers, gently unfinished at its edges. Around it, the world hushes, not to close, but to leave room. The field of unwritten scenes stretches further, growing quiet with anticipation. Overhead, the sky slowly folds into itself, preserving the narrative daylight for later. The detective stands at your side, their outlines softening into possibility. The noodle coils around a punctuation tree and whispers, "We've come far enough to pause." Flaky, hovering like a parenthesis in mid-air, nods. This is a comma, not a period. The bridge remains behind you. The field opens before you. And beneath your feet, a new path begins to trace itself in real time, glowing faintly with ideas not yet born. You close the notebook, but not all the way. Just enough. A ribbon marks the page. The cursor fades, not gone, just sleeping. Above the page, one line writes itself, slow and patient. To be continued when the story wakes up again. And then, soft white space. Waiting. Listening. Ready.